Hi everyone, welcome back to English 112. This is for our class for Tuesday, November 8th, where I wanted to put some closure onto Midsummer Night's Dream. And also talk about paper number 1, which if you've submitted paper number 1 in, I should have returned it to you with a letter grade, unlike the journals that had a checkmark grade, and some comments. And hopefully you were able to read my comments. If it turns out that you couldn't read my comments, please let me know and I'll be happy to decipher for you. And as you know, you all have the option of doing a revision if you'd so like to earn a higher grade. I ask that you take my comments into account, and if it turns out that you need further direction, please feel free to contact me and I can give you additional suggestions. And I ask that you submit in the original evaluated copy from me along with your revisions so that I can compare and contrast the two, and you would earn the higher of the two grades. And you've got up until the ending of the semester to do that, but certainly the sooner you do that, the better off you are. Now, the second paper, which we'll be talking about very shortly, will be about drama, but it will be a very similar kind of paper to what you did with short story in terms of length, approximately 4 to 5 pages. And also, it will be a critical paper so that you don't need to do outside research. And in terms of the second paper, it'll be due at the very ending of the semester, so chances are that you would not have time to do a revision. The idea is that you've learned what you needed to learn with the first paper, so therefore you could proceed with the second paper. That said, I have had students that have submitted in the second paper early enough so that there was the possibility of revision, though that's something that we would have to negotiate. The first paper revision does not have to be negotiated. Everybody has the option of doing that for a higher grade. And as I always say, this is the way professional writers write. They get a lot of feedback and editorial comments that they incorporate into their writing. If you'll remember, in our syllabus, which is in the syllabus and other documents folder, it talks a little bit about grading criteria, the distinction between what an A is and a B and a C. And I just wanted to review that with you, that the A paper develops a clear central idea with originality, depth of thought, and displays a consistent sense of audience. Its topic is developed with clear and logical supporting ideas. The organization is sound. Each paragraph has a core idea supported by fitting examples and illustrations. Paragraphs are joined to those following and those before with smooth links. Sentences are well put together and varied, and the paper is generally free of common errors in grammar, punctuation, and spelling. So that's what an A or an excellent would be. And then a B, or a good paper, would be a paper that has a clearly stated central idea but lacks energy or depth of thought. It draws safe conclusions. The topic is interesting, focused adequately, and logically developed, however. Organization is correct and logical, but sometimes it strains a bit. Each paragraph does have a central idea, examples or illustrations, and a logical point, although some of the transitions between paragraphs aren't necessarily as smooth as they could be. Sentences have little variety in structure, and we're beginning to see some errors in grammar, spelling, and punctuation. The C paper, or the satisfactory paper. The C paper has a reasonably clear central idea and shows an adequate grasp for the reason of the assignment, such as direction, description, persuasion, but the focus is blurred in some places. The development with examples or illustrations is sketchy in some points. The organization isn't always clear. Most paragraphs have a sense of organization, but development is vague. Transition between paragraphs is awkward, even sometimes lacking. And now we're beginning to see patterns of mistakes in grammar, spelling, and punctuation. The D paper, less than satisfactory, does not state or develop a central idea, though the pattern shows the writer has some central concept. The sense of audience is inconsistent. The organization is hard to follow, and frequently paragraphs seem to lack a central idea. Transitions are scanty or even absent. Sentences are awkward or incorrectly constructed. The writing does not indicate college level proficiency. There are frequent errors in grammar, punctuation, and spelling. And then lastly, the F paper, the unsatisfactory paper. The F paper states no central idea, has no connection to a single topic. The writing is contradictory and characterized by many apparent changes of subject. No evidence of overall editing or writing beyond a first draft stage is evident. Most sentences have errors in construction. Paragraphing is haphazard or non existent, and there are many errors in grammar, punctuation, and spelling. Occasionally, what I might have done with the paper is instructed you to do a revision because you didn't necessarily follow the directions for the assignment. So I would have indicated the reasons why, and I would have asked you for a revision so that you could earn a letter grade. And again, of course, if you've got questions about any of my responses to your papers, please let me know. In terms of where I'm hopeful that you are now is that you would have finished reading A Midsummer Night's Dream. As we know, reading is essential. Just because we've seen a performance, that doesn't in any way substitute for reading, especially when it comes to Shakespeare, because the writing is so nuanced. And then ultimately, we will be ending our drama section with our third and final drama, which happens to be Raisin in the Sun. So if you look in the notes below, you'll see that I've included a link to the play, A Raisin in the Sun. This is a play that is not included in your textbook, but I have ordered it as a separate text. It's also on reserve in the GCC library as well. And again, we will watch a performance. This instance, it is the film version that Lorraine Hansberry, the playwright herself, had worked on. And then ultimately, what we will do is talk a little bit about the play itself. So I'm hopeful that you are in the midst of reading A Raisin in the Sun while we are talking about A Midsummer Night's Dream. As I indicated, I'll be providing some paper topics and also some ideas for journals, because you will be also responding with a journal in the similar way that you did with short story, though this journal is in response to the 3 dramas that we've read, so you don't have choice. Those would be Oedipus the King, A Midsummer Night's Dream, and ultimately A Raisin in the Sun. So we were talking about A Midsummer Night's Dream. We've been talking about performance and also talking about plot. You'll see in the notes below some of the themes that I wanted to highlight about the play. That love makes everyone, regardless of age or status, an idiot. And I think we saw that with all of the different couples who represented different ages and different social stations, and also different stages of relationship. That love can destroy friendships, as we see in Act 3 of this play. If it had turned into a tragedy, the lovers would have come to blows, but we know that it's a comedy, so that things have to be resolved in the end. That love is like a spell, and once we're under this spell, we are not in control of ourselves, nor do we have reason or rationality anymore. In fact, love is oftentimes like a dream, something that is uncontrollable and that is unreal and could easily turn into a nightmare. Beauty, which is important in terms of the distinction of appearances between Hermia, who is the short brunette, and Helena, who's the tall blonde. And at the time, and perhaps even in our own time period, tall blonde would be considered to be the epitome of beauty. Yet it's the short brunette that has all of the attention at the beginning of the play. So beauty doesn't necessarily need to be represented by someone who's tall and blonde. Again, Shakespeare sort of questioning some of the social expectations of his time period. That females can be powerful and defy male figures. Though don't expect any easy answers in Shakespeare. We definitely see a Hermia, who is a female who defies her male father, which would have been unheard of at the time period. And by the ending of the play, she gets what she wants. However, Titania defies her male husband. Again, it would have been unheard of at the time. But she doesn't get what she wants. In fact, she's humiliated, and in the end, her fairy husband Oberon takes the changeling child. So we see how the image of female is complicated in Shakespeare's plays. And then we have Helena, who can be seen on both sides of the spectrum. In some ways, a very passive and weak female, as she chases after Demetrius when he's clearly expressed no interest in her. In fact, she degrades herself in many respects. That said, she also talks about how women were not made to woo. She takes the active role of pursuer, which would be unusual at the time, and she's successful by getting what she wants at the end. So again, we see how Shakespeare complicates some of the ideas of female. And even Theseus and Hippolyta, we know that Hippolyta is a strong female warrior woman, but ultimately she's been conquered by Theseus. The idea in a comedy is that they learn to love one another and they develop affection for one another. So while the beginning of the play might start with some conflict between them, by the ending of the play, the sense is that it's resolved. That virginity is important, and at the time period, especially for female, she would be viewed as damaged goods if she had lost her virginity prior to marriage. So for our comedic ending, it's important that both Helena and Hermia are virginal at the ending of the play, even though there's references throughout the play for their virginity being taken. At one point, in fact, Demetrius has been accused by Lysander of making love to Neater's daughter. That isn't literally having sexual relations, that's about wooing. And then, of course, when Helena is chasing Demetrius in the forest, he tells her, if you continue, I will do thee mischief in the woods. That basically he's threatening to take her virginity. And even Hermia and Lysander, that scene in the woods where Lysander wants to lie more closely to Hermia, and she says, lie further off, thou rhymest prettily. The idea that she doesn't want to be tempted to lose her virginity. Though even though virginity is so important in this play, it's set in midsummer, which is a pagan holiday that is the longest day of the year, the equinox, and it is associated with fertility and celebrated through sexual union. So again, Shakespeare sort of changes the dynamic by putting this play in a very sexually charged night, Midsummer Night's Dream, and also making reference to May Day, which is another pagan holiday. That is the 1st of May, which is also a celebration of fertility rites. You might have heard of the maypole in the celebration of May Day, where you dance around the maypole. The maypole is supposed to be representative of a phallic symbol. Again, a day associated with fertility. So we see how Shakespeare basically questions some of the morals of his time by, yes, promoting the idea of sexual purity, but yet setting the play during very pagan and very sexually charged times. And the donkey and the ass was known during the time period of the Renaissance, or was believed to be the most well-endowed creature in the animal kingdom. And depending on the production that you watch of A Midsummer Night's Dream, sometimes it's more obvious than others. But when Bottom is turned into an ass, that he and Fairy Titania basically consummate their relationship. Again, rather risque. But the Shakespearean period was rather risque in terms of sex and also in terms of violence, but not with politics. So one had to be much more cautious with making political statements. That's not to say that Shakespeare didn't make political statements, but he needed to make sure that they weren't quite as obvious. And again, Shakespearean plays were the television of the day. They appealed to all levels of audience, child and adult, rich and poor, educated and non-educated. So there are multiple layers of meaning in Shakespeare. One of the things that you might have noticed in listening to Shakespeare's play is the sound of the rhyme. Shakespeare oftentimes uses rhyme, and rhyme was supposed to be connected with higher levels of society. And prose or complete sentences would be connected with the lower levels of society. But Shakespeare would often mix this up as well and have the lower levels of society speak in rhyme to show how just because somebody doesn't have education or just because somebody doesn't necessarily have birthright, that doesn't necessarily mean that they can't ascend into a superior position. Likewise, you can have somebody who is of a particular station in society or of a particular education who should be speaking in poetry descend into speaking in prose or complete sentences to show that no one is protected from experiencing descent in their position if they show the inability to have reason or rationality. So this was one of the ways that Shakespeare could question the hierarchy that existed in his society, which was based on birthright, just through the use of language. You might have also noticed that many times Shakespeare uses iambic pentameter. This is a 10-syllable line, and it has a stressed and an unstressed syllable, so it sounds like bum bum, bum bum, bum bum, bum bum. Or shall I compare thee to a summer's day? And you would count that out and have 10 syllables of stressed and unstressed. And this is from one of Shakespeare's most famous poems. We haven't gotten to the poetry section yet, but we will. His sonnet, Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day? But you will see a good amount of iambic pentameter in the dialogue of the characters as well. And this stress and unstress, or bum 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 bum, mimics a heartbeat. And in fact, some scholars have said that's one of the reasons why Shakespearean language is so appealing to the ear, because it mimics probably one of the first sounds that we've all heard in our mother's womb, the heartbeat. Now, of course, the writing will have symbolism and metaphor in addition to many of the poetic forms that I'm talking about. So, that said, I wanted to talk about some of my favorite quotes in Shakespeare, and you can see this, or in A Midsummer Night's Dream, I should say, not Shakespeare as a whole. And you can see this in the notes below, and I've divided it up by act. Shakespeare is known for his wit, which is illustrated in a very simple line when Lysander says to Demetrius, "You have her father's love, Demetrius. Let me have Hermias." And that's in Act 1, Scene 1, line 93 through 94. And note that when we refer to Shakespeare quotation, we don't refer to page number. We refer to act, scene, and line, because Shakespearean plays are divided by act, scene, and line, which universalizes the play. So regardless of the edition of the play that you are using, you can refer to the act, the scene, and the line, and reference the exact place that we're at. So in parenthetical documentation, when we are quoting from Shakespeare, we don't put page number. We put act, period, scene, period, and then the line number, much like I've done in the notes below. So some of the history, the background that occurs prior to the play itself. This is when Lysander has said that Demetrius has made love to Neater's daughter Helena. In other words, Lysander and Helena once had a relationship prior to the play. They no longer do. This is Helena's justification for continuing to pursue Demetrius. And it also leads to the question, if one has pledged oneself in love, does one have a responsibility to maintain that pledge, even when feelings change? Because one of the major themes of the play is just how fickle love happens to be. One of the morals of the play is stated in Act 1 by Lysander, when he says in Act 1, Scene 1, line 134, that the course of true love never did run smooth. To give you an example of rhyme, very simple rhyme, and this is in Act 1, and it's stated by Hermia. Take comfort, he no more shall see my face. Lysander and myself will fly this place. Before the time I did Lysander see, seemed Athens as a paradise to me. Oh, then what graces in my love do dwell, that he had turned a heaven unto a hell. Act 1, Scene 1, line 202 to 207. And notice how face rhymes with place, see rhymes with me, dwell rhymes with hell. When two lines rhyme together, that's known as a couplet. So this is a very natural rhyme that forwards the plot. That said, Bonham oftentimes utilizes rhyme, but it's bad rhyme. It's cliche and it's oftentimes nonsensical. So this is an example of bad rhyme that occurs shortly thereafter, also in Act 1. The raging rocks and shivering shocks shall break the locks of prison gates, and Phoebus' car shall shine from far and make and mar the foolish fates. Even worse, he comments on that afterwards and says, that was lofty, to show how arrogant he is. That's Act 1, Scene 2, line 31 through 38. It has rhyme, but it doesn't really say much of anything. It's almost like saying roses are red, violets are blue, sugar is sweet, and so are you. It's very cliche, although there is rhyme and there is a beat to it. So in Act 2, one of the major quotes about power dynamics illustrates the theme in this play that love relationships are oftentimes about power, who has it and who doesn't, and vying for that power. So Titania talks a little bit about how she's arguing with Oberon about this changeling boy. The assumption is that Oberon perhaps has some jealousy over the fact that she's spending so much time with this boy. But Oberon is also the male in the relationship, and he doesn't need to have any justification for anything. His rule is law. So when he says, I want the changeling boy, and she dares to defy him, he's furious. More so, not only has she dared to defy him, she has, and this is in Act 2, Scene 1, line 63, forsworn his bed and company. In other words, she's denying him sexual relations. Another way that she's trying to exert power in their relationship as he's trying to exert power. Now, sometimes you've got some odd dialogue that seems out of place. It's mostly for us as audience. And this occurs in, for instance, Act 2, Scene 1, line 186, when Oberon says, I am invisible. This is a cue for us as the audience to understand that as a fairy, he's invisible so that the other actors on stage can't see him. There really isn't any reason or rationale for him to say that outside of informing us as audience. Now, the threat that I was referencing from Demetrius is in Act 2, Scene 1, line 236 to 237, when Demetrius says to Helena, if thou follow me, I shall do thee mischief in the wood. That basically he's threatening to take her virginity. And her response is about gender, which I was also referencing earlier. Act 2, Scene 1, line 240 to 242. Your wrongs, Helena says to Demetrius, do set a scandal on my sex. We cannot fight for love as men may do. We should be wooed, and we're not made to woo. In other words, that women ultimately should not take the active role of pursuer, yet she's being forced into this. And of course, modesty, as I was referencing earlier in Act 2, when Hermia says in Act 2, Scene 2, line 57, when she tells Lysander, for love and courtesy lie further off in humane modesty. Now, Act 3, which will be the pinnacle of tension in a Shakespearean play. Act 1 is when we get the introduction to characters. Act 2 is when we get the beginning of conflict. Act 3 is the height of conflict. This is where you get insults. They're fast and furious in Act 3. And if this were not a comedy, probably these lovers would come to blows with one another and there would be death and destruction. But we know it is a comedy, so there has to be a resolution. But note when bottom of all of the characters says in Act 3, Scene 2, line 143 to 144, that reason and love keep little company nowadays. One of the morals of the play, we wouldn't expect it to be from bottom, but this is typical Shakespeare, where oftentimes Shakespeare would put very insightful language into the lower level characters to show that the lower levels, again, have the ability to ascend their position. And oftentimes, it's the higher level characters who do very asinine things. Though, of course, we know that bottom is very asinine to begin with, so it's particularly appropriate that he's been turned into an ass, which illustrates how blind love is when Queen Titania, of all of the characters, falls in love with an ass. With Shakespeare asking us rhetorically, how many of us have ever fallen in love with an ass and not realized it until after the fact? Timeless and universal themes. Puck also provides a message or a moral in Act 3, Scene 2, line 115. Lord, what fools these mortals be. And that definitely is something that we see in the play, though, of course, Titania and Oberon have been acting foolish as well. Some of the insults that might not seem like insults. At one point, Helena says to Hermia, you puppet. Act 3, Scene 2, line 288. A puppet is something that's small, so this is an insult about being of shorter stature. But a puppet is also controlled by another, so Helena is suggesting that Hermia doesn't have free will. And also that Hermia is fake because a puppet isn't real. Hermia responds with her own insult, calling Helena in Act 3, Scene 2, line 296, you painted maypole. Now, the maypole was a phallic symbol during May Day celebrations. So basically, Hermia has just called her former best friend Helena a maypole, because after all, Helena is tall and thin, but she's also called her a phallus. And painted means cosmetics. The idea that Helena is using cosmetics, much like a strumpet or a prostitute, to deceive men. And notice how easily we move from love to hate. In fact, Hermia is told to get away, and she's called an Ethiop. Now, keep this in mind that Ethiop would be of Ethiopia, and Hermia has dark hair and dark eyes. Probably not so much dark skin, but dark hair and dark eyes. So this is an insult about her appearance. And of course, her former love has now moved to hate. Or if you've heard the old cliche, there's a thin line between love and hate. And then Lysander continues on and says, should I hurt her, strike her, kill her dead? So his first go-to is perhaps I should kill her, but I guess not. Act 3, Scene 2, line 268 to 269. And then Lysander continues on, insulting Hermia by saying, get you gone, you dwarf, you minimus, you bead, you acorn. And these are all insults based again on her small stature. And again, a brunette of small stature was not supposed to have as much beauty as a tall blonde, which leads to some of the conflict in the beginning of the play, because at the beginning of the play, both men, Demetrius and Lysander, are in love with the shorter brunette. And then, of course, by the middle of the play, through the manipulation of magic juice, because love is like a magic spell, and we're out of control when we're basically under it. Now we have both men in love with Helena, and Helena and Hermia are coming to blows, showing how love can destroy friendships. So we know there has to be resolution because this is a comedy, which is what we're going to get in Act 4. And not only is the love juice removed from Demetrius's eyes so that he now loves, or I'm sorry, from Lysander's eyes, so that he returns to loving Hermia. And of course, the love juice remains in Demetrius's eyes so that he remains loving Helena. That at this point, Theseus is consulted, and he decides that because the lovers are content with each other, he will overbear Aegeus's will. Act 5, Scene 1, line 179. Keep in mind that at the beginning of the play, Father Aegeus, in desperation, goes to the law of the land, and this happens to be Theseus, demanding that Theseus require his daughter to follow her father's will. And Theseus, perhaps very cleverly, decides to give Hermia some time to think about it. Not only does that give Hermia time to run away so that the plot can be forwarded, but it also means that he doesn't have to make a political decision and take a side that would alienate someone. And it seems like this is the best that he's going to be able to do now that all four lovers are happy. The one who is unhappy is Aegeus. So I don't think we're going to get any more of a positive ending than this. So I think Theseus cuts his losses by alienating Aegeus, who accepts Theseus's will now that we've got the four lovers. I'm not so sure if I would want to be Demetrius, because I'm ultimately, if I were Demetrius, being manipulated through love juice to love Helena. Not sure how happy of an ending that is. However, keep in mind that prior to the play, Demetrius had pledged himself to Helena, so perhaps there's a certain level of responsibility to live up to his initial wooing. You know, the question of if you've declared love for someone, are you required to maintain that love? The moral, which comes from bottom of all people again, is that man is but an ass. Of course, he doesn't understand the nuances of what he's saying because he is a laborer and he is at the bottom of the social scale. But we've definitely seen that throughout the play, that man is but an ass, particularly when it comes to love relationships. Now, that said, Shakespeare is very clever as a playwright. He understands that he's made several statements that could be quite offensive to many audience members, including the Queen herself, who would have been sitting in the audience and watching these plays. Fortunately for us, plays were seen kind of lowbrow at the time period, but the Queen enjoyed going to the theater, and certainly no one was going to question the Queen. And her support, both her political support and her economic support, helped to preserve these plays for us to read them. However, I can imagine how a queen could be offended by being told that all of humanity is an ass, or how a queen could be offended by having a strong woman whose will is ultimately defied, and that what Shakespeare could do, and I think what Shakespeare does do, is put a little bit of a compliment in there for the queen. So, where Theseus and Hippolyta are getting ready to see the play within the play. And in fact, it almost seems like A Midsummer Night's Dream ends in Act 4, and we don't need Act 5, but we do need Act 5, that play within a play, because it's going to be a commentary on what we've just viewed about love. But there seems to be just a very silly piece of, or a very short piece of dialogue that would seem to not have much relevance at all in Act 4, Scene 1, line 93 to 100. And this is when Theseus again is talking to Hippolyta, and he's saying that where I've come, great clerks have proposed to greet me with premeditated welcomes, and they've shivered and looked pale, and in conclusion have dumbly broken off, yet I've picked a welcome. Basically, what he's talking about is that sometimes some of their subjects have been so nervous in front of him that they haven't given him a proper welcome that a king should deserve, but that he sees that as a compliment, not as an insult, because the fact that somebody would be so nervous in his presence means that they truly understand his superiority as king. And this is oftentimes read as Shakespeare saying this about Queen Elizabeth herself, that if she were watching in the audience, she would probably connect with King Theseus and think that she herself is very similar, that she has that grace, that she can take a welcome from a shiver and a pale look. And in someone's dumbly breaking off, that is not an insult, but that's instead a compliment about her position and about her power. Then, of course, in Act 5, and we know that Act 5 is a wonderful opportunity for Shakespeare to illustrate how love can go wrong, because we have a tragedy, which is what we could have gotten in A Midsummer Night's Dream if it wasn't a comedy. It's a great opportunity for Shakespeare to give humor, because we see Bottom and his cohorts being absolutely ridiculous in their production of Pyramus and Thisbe. It's poorly written, it's poorly acted, it's poorly directed, it's just poor. And this is oftentimes read as Shakespeare making a commentary about his competitors, that rather than telling us that his competitors are poor actors and poor directors and poor writers, he shows us through a play like Pyramus and Thisbe and allows us to make the decision. We can see the competition and see something that's nonsense. So much so that Pyramus and Thisbe, everything has to be explained to the audience. The idea that the audience needs to be told that the lion really isn't a lion, so they have nothing to fear, and that someone needs to play moonshine so the audience understands moonshine. Again, it reminds me of an elementary school production, but when a 6-year-old is doing it, it's cute. When an adult is doing it, it's not cute. So this is a great opportunity for Shakespeare to illustrate what his competition is doing, so that hopefully we will go see Shakespeare's next play. And in fact, Romeo and Juliet was written at around this time period, so we could see Pyramus and Thisbe as perhaps a kind of preview of what Shakespeare was thinking about with Romeo and Juliet. Again, we don't know exactly when the plays were written. We've got many questions about the plays and the content of the plays and even the dates of the plays, but at least that's what scholars have determined. It also shows a lack of insight from the characters who are watching this play within a play. So Hippolyta and Theseus and Hermia and Helena and Demetrius and Lysander are enjoying this immensely, thinking about how ridiculous all of this is, Pyramus and Thisbe. But never once do they stop to realize that they themselves had been equally ridiculous just hours earlier. Granted, they were under the influence of a love spell, but nevertheless, they were equally absurd when it came to love. So they don't have insight into this, even though they had truly experienced this, and Pyramus and Thisbe is just a play. It's not real. Though, of course, the real lesson is for us as audience watching this, because ultimately the entire play is fiction. There is no Theseus, there is no Hippolyta or Hermia or Helena or Demetrius or Lysander. These are actors playing roles. But if we watch this play and we laugh and we never once realize that we ourselves have been equally absurd and ridiculous when it's come to love, then we've learned nothing from Shakespeare. One thing I'll say about Shakespeare is at least he's equal opportunity. So he criticizes, but he criticizes everybody. So That said, having Puck at the ending offer an apology is brilliant from Shakespeare's perspective because, again, there are lots of people who have been critiqued. In fact, I wonder who has not been criticized in this play. So Puck is oftentimes viewed as a Shakespearean character, controlling and manipulating the action. And having Puck say to the audience in one of Shakespeare's most famous speeches, and this is in Act 5, Scene 1, line 423, "If we shadows have offended, think but this and all is mended, that you have but slumbered here, while these visions did appear. And this weak and idle theme, no more yielding, but a dream. Gentles, do not reprehend. If you pardon, we will mend. And as I am an honest Puck, if we have unearned luck, now to escape the serpent's tongue, we will make amends ere long, else the Puck a liar call. So good night unto you all. Give me your hands if we be friends, and Robin shall restore amends." Lots of things going on in this speech. Basically, Puck is asking for forgiveness, saying if you were offended, just think that this was a dream. And that's love. Love is a kind of dream, something that's uncontrollable. And when he says gentles, this would be gentlemen and gentle ladies, do not reprehend, do not criticize. As I am an honest Puck, if we have unearned luck. Now, the thing is, Puck is not honest. Puck is mischievous, and he likes to lie. So, in some ways, this is very much a backhanded apology, because the reality is that Puck is not honest. So, can we truly trust this apology? To escape the serpent's tongue, the hissing that could occur from audience members if they were displeased. So good night unto you all, basically telling us the play is over. Give me your hands if we be friends, asking for applause at this point. And Robin, since Puck is also known as Robin Goodfellow, shall restore amends. So think of this as Puck the character asking for forgiveness. Think of this as the actor playing Puck asking for forgiveness. Think of this as Shakespeare through the actor who's playing Puck asking for forgiveness. So one last quote that I wanted to leave you with. I don't take credit nor blame for this, but it is one of the ways that Shakespeare was known for being quite bawdy in his language, so that his words could be interpreted in multiple ways. And this happens to be in the play that's so ridiculous, Pyramus and Thisbe, Act 5, Scene 1, line 190. And this is where Pyramus and Thisbe are speaking to one another. And at one point, Thisbe says, "My cherry lips have often kissed thy stones with lime and hair knit up in thee." This has oftentimes been read as a reference to oral sex. "My cherry lips have often kissed thy stones being testicles, thy stones with lime and hair," in other words, hair being pubic hair, "knit up in thee." So, again, I'll leave you with that just to show that Shakespeare was quite bawdy, and these are probably the elements that were not discussed if you studied A Midsummer Night's Dream in grade school or junior high or even in high school. They've cleaned up the play because it's usually a play that is appropriate for younger audiences because you don't have death and because you've got fairies, so you've got a magical land. That said, again, the Renaissance was quite a bawdy period, so Shakespeare didn't shy away from sex, but he did have to shy away from politics, or at least be careful as to how he proceeded. So that leaves us with our attendance question. And I thought that I would ask you to identify one of your favorite quotes and why it's one of your favorite quotes. It could be one of the quotes that I've referenced, but it could be a completely new quote as well that I haven't referenced. But to identify a quote in A Midsummer Night's Dream that you are particularly fond of and indicate why. As usual, there's no right or wrong answer to this, and you're not required to respond to your classmates, but you are required to read your classmates' responses as well as my responses to them. That would give you an idea of what we would have talked about in class discussion. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class as we move from Shakespeare to our final drama, A Raisin in the Sun by Lorraine Hansberry. Take care. Bye-bye.